I remember back when I was a young evangelical Christian reading my first book of apologetics and being stunned by just how lame it was. Really? You're the servants of the all-wise, all-knowing creator of the universe, and this is the best you can do? Well, in today's episode, Geisler and Turek is going to give us a pretty good example of why I felt that way. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Last time, Geisler and Turek tried to prove that God exists by using the fine-tuning argument, or as I like to call it, the argument from wishful thinking, because no matter how many cool science facts you can amaze folks with, it don't demonstrate intelligent design unless and until you can demonstrate that it could and would be different in the absence of an intelligent designer. I mean, maybe it's true that if pi was slightly smaller, automobile tires wouldn't reach all the way around the wheel rims and everybody'd have flat tires. That don't mean nothing unless and until you can show that pi could and would be smaller without some god to make it right. And needless to say, Geisler and Turek never even tried to show that any of their quote-unquote fine-tuned constants could be any different, let alone showing that they would be without intelligent intervention. All they did was throw their hands up in the air and holler, "Wow, that's incredible," as if personal incredulity were any kind of reliable guide to what is or is not possible. And with that kind of argument, we don't even need to raise any kind of rebuttal beyond pointing out the fact that they ain't even made any actual arguments yet. Still, Geisler and Turek's going to follow the standard protocol for a legitimate debate, so they's got to pretend that they's addressing skeptical objections to the fine-tuning argument. And that's what we's going to cover today. The title of this section is, quote, "Proof Forgot!" Exclamation point. How do atheists respond? End quote. Notice it's not just evidence, it's proof. So there's a tactic for you. If you have an argument that boils down to wishful thinking, you can make it stronger by calling it proof. If he's an apologist anyway. And here's what they have to say about their so-called proof. Quote, "Some atheists admit that there's some kind of designer out there. Fred Hoyle had his atheism shaken by the Anthropic principle and the complexity he saw in life." End quote. And they follow that up with a quote mine from a paper that Hoyle published in 1982 in the Annual Review of Astronomy and Astrophysics. And we'll get to the quote in a minute, but let's just take a second to remember who Fred Hoyle is. Sir Fred Hoyle was a famous astronomer, researcher, and science fiction writer who lived from 1913 to 2001. His most famous contribution to astronomy was his research into stellar nucleosynthesis, the process by which stars form elements heavier than helium. And on the other hand, he's also famous for rejecting the Big Bang Theory, which he thought sounded too much like some kind of special creationism. So it's kind of ironic that Geisler and Turek would claim that his atheism was ever shaken. The other somewhat unusual thing he was famous for was his promotion of the idea of panspermia, the notion that there's an advanced, superintelligent race of aliens out there somewheres artificially sowing the seeds of life all over the universe. And maybe the fact that he was a published and successful science fiction writer had something to do with his romanticized view of that topic. So now let's get to that bit that Geisler and Turek cite as showing that Hoyle's atheism was quote-unquote shaken. Quote, "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature." End quote. Now, Geisler and Turek has been discussing 122 alleged anthropic constants that supposedly provide evidence of divine design. And when you read this quote from Fred Hoyle in that context, you might think that Fred Hoyle agreed with Geisler and Turek that their interpretation of the anthropic principle was correct and that the universe shows signs of actual design. So you might be surprised to actually read Fred Hoyle's paper and find out that he was talking about his pet theory of panspermia, with intelligent aliens manufacturing the precise ingredients needed in order to spread biological life throughout the universe. and I'll put a link in the description so you can read that paper. And okay, if you're familiar with how apologetics works, then maybe you wouldn't be surprised to find out that a couple of apologists was quoting a famous scientist out of context in order to create a false impression that the evidence supported the apologists. But yeah, Geisler and Turek is trying to make it sound like Fred Hoyle is conceding the supremacy of the Anthropic principle when all he's really doing is saying aliens. Moving on, Geisler and Turek say, quote, other atheists admit design, but then claim there is no designer. They say it all happened by chance. Atheists have had to resort to wild speculation to give chance more of a chance. Their speculation is called the multiple universe theory. End quote. And there's something interesting going on here. Geisler and Turek is pretending that they's addressing skeptical criticisms of the fine-tuning argument, but they ain't addressing or even mentioning any of the obvious skeptical criticisms. Instead, they toss in a throwaway quote mine from Fred Hoyle, and then they bring up recent, controversial conjectures in modern quantum physics, which they's going to misunderstand and misrepresent and then declare victory. And that's it. That's their attempt at addressing skeptical criticisms of the fine-tuning argument. It's almost like they was
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Yeah, kind of like that. You ain't supposed to listen to the actual skeptics. You're supposed to be so amazed and astonished by this fancy multiple universe theory that you believe everything Osler and Turek has to say. Geisler and Turek. And naturally, we ain't going to get a straightforward explanation of quote-unquote multiple universe theory from Geisler and Turek. They can't even get the name right. For one thing, it ain't a theory. There ain't enough corroborating evidence to justify calling it a theory. And even hypothesis might be too strong a term, since it's difficult to see how such a thing could ever be tested. For our purposes, I think it'd be better off to call it a concept or even a conjecture. And okay, different folks use different names sometimes, but based on how Geisler and Turek describe it, it sounds like what they really mean is the multiverse conjecture. Or I should say conjectures, plural, because there's more than one. If you look up multiverse on Wikipedia, you'll find all kinds of different proposals about what kind of multiverse might exist and why it might exist and so on. And you'll also find an unfortunate tendency to use the word theory in the non-scientific sense, which is potentially confusing and which is why you need to take everything on Wikipedia with a grain of salt. But at least it's got a lot of links to outside sources, so it makes a good jumping off place for starting your research. And one of the things the Wikipedia page makes abundantly clear is that the multiverse conjectures is a bunch of highly speculative and controversial proposals, with many scientists expressing strong doubts about whether such a notion could ever be testable in any meaningful way. In other words, far from the multiverse or multiverses being the atheist's refuge away from the anthropic principle, the multiverse as currently understood is perhaps best described as fiction suitable for inspiring comic books. It ain't nowheres near being a skeptical explanation of anything. So with that background out of the way, let's see what Geisler and Turek have to say about their so-called multiple universe theory. Quote, according to the multiple universe theory, there actually are an infinite number of universes in existence, and we just happen to be lucky enough to be in the universe with the right conditions. End quote. And this is a somewhat garbled presentation of what's called the weak anthropic principle. It ain't that we's lucky, it's just that if conditions wasn't the right conditions for us to exist, then we wouldn't be here noticing the conditions. So the fact that we's here means the conditions have to be right. Even without any multiverse existing, that right there actually does a pretty good job of explaining why we see the quote-unquote fine-tuning. If in the uncreated nature of objective reality did not contain the properties necessary for our existence, we wouldn't be here observing objective reality. And remember, so far Geisler and Turek ain't even attempted to demonstrate that their so-called anthropic constants could possibly be any different, let alone that they would be. So really, there ain't nothing here that ain't covered by the weak anthropic principle. Meanwhile, Geisler and Turek is dead set on disproving the so-called multiple universe theory, And I think it's going to be very instructive to look at the approaches that they think is going to justify the conclusion that the MUT is false. Bear in mind that the multiverse conjecture ain't even up to the level of hypothesis yet, so they should have an easy time showing that it ain't up to skeptical standards. But the way they go about showing it is going to be instructive. Quote, "First and most significantly, there's no evidence for it." End quote. Yes, that's right. Dr. Norman Geisler and Dr. Frank Turek, two preeminent Christian apologists, is asserting that it's reasonable to reject claims for which there is no evidence. If and you make a claim, then it's on you to back that claim up, or else everyone else is justified in rejecting it, just like Geisler and Turek reject the MUT, and just like atheists reject God. And notice, Geisler and Turek ain't saying that they themselves have any burden of proof to prove that there ain't any multiverse. They ain't telling us that by not accepting the conclusion, they themselves are making any positive claim for the non-existence of the multiverse. They agree that whoever claims that something does exist is the one with the burden of proof. And by the way, like we said before, this is a valid objection to the multiverse conjecture. It's an interesting question to explore, and maybe someday it'll lead to an actual hypothesis that can be tested and for which evidence for or against it can be obtained. But for right now, with the information and evidence we got so far, it's fair to reject the multiverse conjecture based on a lack of evidence, just like it's fair to reject the God conjecture on the same basis. Objection number 2. Quote, "Second, as we discussed in the last chapter, an infinite number of finite things is an actual impossibility. There can't be an unlimited number of limited universes." End quote. And this one might be arguable on a couple of counts. First of all, this claim exceeds what they've actually demonstrated. In the last chapter, they argued that nothing can have an infinite history since these various philosophical arguments against the possibility that you could get to the last day of an infinite history, there being no such thing as a last element of an infinite set. But that only applies to chronological orderings. That don't prove that there can't be, say, an infinite number of light years in the radius of the physical universe, or any other infinite set of things that exists side by side at the same time. It might be possible to prove that no such infinity could exist, but Geisler and Turek didn't do it. And so they can't rightly claim that their argument in the last chapter applies to the question of how many universes you can have in a multiverse. But second, it don't necessarily take an infinite number of universes to give us one with the so-called anthropic constants we see around us. All that's actually needed is a finite number large enough that there's a non-zero chance that our universe could be one of them. Even if that non-zero chance was a very, very small number, it's still enough that the weak anthropic principle would be sufficient to account for the constants we see. Maybe we was just lucky, like they said. People do win the lottery despite low odds. And of course, we can't let this one pass by without reminding ourselves once again that their proof in the last chapter was a proof that nothing can have an infinite history, not even God, which contradicts what the Bible says about God having existed for all eternity. So boom, there goes Jehovah.
Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah!
Next objection. Quote, "Third, even if other universes could exist, they would need fine-tuning to get started just as our universe did. So positing multiple universes doesn't eliminate the need for a designer, it multiplies the need for a designer."
No.
This one kind of falls apart under its own weight. Nothing says that any other universe would need to be fine-tuned to support life. That's kind of the whole point of the multiverse objection to the fine-tuning argument. You could have a large number of randomly tuned universes, most of which are not fine-tuned to support life, as long as at least one of them was. That don't prove that the multiverse conjecture is correct, of course, but whether it's true or not, this particular objection is bogus. Last one. Quote, "Fourth, the multiple universe theory is so broad that any event can be explained away by it." End quote. So, kind of like creationism and the various responses to the problem of evil, then. Yeah, got it. This one, is a valid objection. That which explains every possible thing don't explain nothing. It's unfalsifiable, which is one of the scientific objections to the multiverse conjecture, as well as to gods with mysterious ways. Geisler and Turek is justified in rejecting the multiverse on this basis, just like the rest of us is justified in rejecting their God on the same basis. And that's basically the end of their pretense of addressing skeptical objections to the fine-tuning argument. 1 quote mine and 4 objections. And of the 4 objections, the only 2 that actually work are the ones that apply just as strongly, if not more so, to Christianity. This entire section is just one long tirade of the pot calling the copper kettle black. The next section of this chapter is basically just a long sermon on the topic of, wow, look at how many stars there are. There must be a God, because stars is a lot of stars. There ain't really nothing here but appeals to emotion and superstition, so I ain't going to waste your time addressing it. Which brings us to the conclusion of Chapter 4, where Geisler and Turek once again bring up the ad hominem fallacy of claiming that skeptics only reject the fine-tuning arguments because they's just cartoon bad guys or something. First, though, they admit that their entire argument is nothing more than an appeal to emotion and intuition, which is a polite way of saying superstition. Quote, "The raw impact of astronauts' experiences reveals the intuitive nature of the teleological argument. You don't need anyone to tell you that something beautifully designed requires a designer. It's practically self-evident." And in a way, that's true. If and you assume that everything beautiful was designed by an intelligent designer, then it's practically self-evident to you that it necessarily requires an intelligent designer, especially if you ignore the question of whether or not it's even possible for any of it to have been any different in the absence of a designer, not to mention the question of whether or not it would have been. You don't need anyone to tell you because you wouldn't listen to them even if they did, unless they happen to confirm your preconceived, intuitive, uninformed notions. And ain't it strange that believers only ever look at things like stars and rocks and such? They never cite the incredible quote-unquote design of the measles virus that makes it such a deadly killer in the absence of vaccines, or the amazing organization it takes to turn simple temperature, pressure, and humidity into a catastrophic tornado or hurricane or blizzard or whatever, or any of the vast number of complex phenomena that self-organize to destroy men, women, and children the world over. They don't mention stuff like that because it'd spoil the mood, and mood is what the teleological argument is all about. Geisler and Turek call it intuition, but it's really just emotion and selective attention to detail, plus a few preconceived ideas. And of course, Geisler and Turek wouldn't be Geisler and Turek if they didn't try to turn the tables here and claim that believers is the true skeptics and skeptics is the true believers. Quote, "Christians have good reasons based on observation, such as the Big Bang and the Anthropic principle, for believing what they believe. Atheists don't. That's why we don't have enough faith to be atheists." End quote. Can't you just hear the envy dripping off their desperate boasting? They know that skepticism is the path to truth, and they know that skeptics reject Christianity. And oh, how they wish it was the other way around. Hebrews 11:1 says that saving faith is, quote, "the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." But Geisler and Turek know that this kind of faith is kind of dumb. They don't want the evidence of things not seen, or in other words, not observed. They want the kind of reality-based faith that skeptics have, based on what can be observed. But that ain't what the Bible preaches. Like Jesus said to doubting Thomas in John 20:29, the biblical message is, "Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." The cognitive dissonance that drives Geisler and Turek to try and turn the tables ends up forcing them to accuse atheists of having the kind of faith that the Bible praises. And when you read the closing of Chapter 4 in the context of Geisler and Turek's painfully desperate desire to be what skeptics are, you realize that in their own backwards fashion, they's actually admitting a very significant truth. Quote, "This blind faith of the atheist reveals that the rejection of a designer is not a head problem. What we have here is a will problem." End quote. By trying to swap roles with atheists and skeptics, Geisler and Turek is inadvertently admitting the real source of the problem here. It ain't a head problem, it's a will problem. They know that the skeptical approach to evidence is better than the biblical faith-based approach, and their subconscious is screaming to them that in order to get the right answer, they need to be the skeptics. But they ain't willing to give up their intuitions and superstitions and feelings and dogma, so they have to settle for trying to make it look like they swapped roles with the skeptics. They go through the motions of being skeptical, but their hearts ain't in it, and that's why their so-called evidence crumbles at the slightest touch of critical thinking. And only the true believers is willing to take it on faith that they's right. Well, I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to wrap it up for me for today. Next time, we'll be starting in on Chapter 5, entitled, quote, The First Life, Natural Law or Divine Awe, end quote. It's sure to be educational, although maybe not in the way that Geisler and Turek intend. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.